If people were to ask me which season had the weakest and strongest beginning and end, my answers would be that Season 3 had the strongest beginning and end. Trust me, those are episodes that I'll get to on the best list. And the season that I think had the weakest beginning and end is Season 2. I already went over Pool Duel and how all of its potential was wasted as it was slapped into a tolerable version of Beach Days. There was also the ending of that season, Dunkelkorn, which was such a predictable episode that if the twist at the end of the episode wasn't there, it would have been a bad episode, and I definitely would have put it as an honorable mention on this list, or even worse. So with how bad Season 2 started off, you'd think that the second episode would be better, right? Absolutely not, because the very next episode after Pool Duel is Tooth Trouble. Consider this as an unpopular opinion of mine, as some friends around me actually do like this episode. So if they like this episode, then I do know that there are some people out there that must like this episode too. However, for me, this was an episode that I was not expecting to dislike this much like the previous entry. And when I watched this episode, I was shocked at how bad I thought it was. Ironically, much like the previous episode on this list, I thought that this episode started off kind of nice, much like the whole tooth from SpongeBob. I like how the episode teaches kids about what the Tooth Fairy is. It's kind of refreshing to see, considering how bad tooth episodes and cartoon shows are. But the episode instantly goes downhill as soon as the Unigang get the idea to be the Tooth Fairy themselves. Now, this doesn't sound like a bad idea considering the fact that in the episode, the Tooth Fairy doesn't come for Puppycorn when he puts his tooth under the pillow. The problem, however, is the execution and how they go and do it. Throughout the entire episode, the Unigang do nothing but cause chaos all throughout the Unikingdom by stealing everyone's teeth, even the adults' teeth. And even at one point, they wake up Old Lady Edith, and she is rightfully angry at the five of them for doing this. I get that they want to bring the spirit of the Tooth Fairy to the Unikingdom, and that is definitely admirable. But breaking into other people's houses is just overboard and illegal. And the ending of this episode is just a slap in the face because, like number 6, the Unigang do not serve any major consequences for doing all of this stuff. But instead, the Tooth Fairy is the one who gets punished, when she had absolutely nothing to do with what happened in the episode. Yes, she yanked out all the Unigang's teeth, but the problem is that that's the most that she does in this episode. Meanwhile, the Unigang are the ones that snuck into other people's houses and stole other people's teeth. And yet they get off lighter than her, which is something that I don't get at all. So, a lot of what I said in number 5 could also apply to number 6, but the reason why I put this episode as number 5 instead of being a tie with number 6 is because the Escape Room of Doom had the Unigang make an attempt to try to make it up to the Score Creeper. It's just that the ending completely ruined it. This episode, on the other hand, not even once does the Unigang even try to make it up to the Tooth Fairy. At the end of the episode, when the Tooth Fairy gets arrested, the Unigang move on to the next scene and act like it's nothing. Guys, you just got the Tooth Fairy arrested and you act like nothing happened. I understand that the Tooth Fairy went a little too far, but she is a little justified in getting angry because these guys were basically doing her job and making her look bad. From what I've heard, there are actually some people that do like this episode, saying that the episode does have some funny moments, but the episode is so overshadowed by all of these issues that the jokes are not even that noticeable. There was one part that was kind of cute and a little funny, which is the part with Brock and the Unigang, but as it stands right now, not only do I think that this is one of the worst episodes of Unikitty, but I also think that this episode is easily the most disappointing episode of the show. If this segment wasn't detailed enough for you guys, and if this segment seems too similar to number 6, well, join me in the next 4 segments. I already made it clear that we're now in the episodes that are really bad back in number 6, but now we're getting into the real meat right now. These are episodes that I would strongly advise you not watch if you're someone who hasn't watched the show and wants to get into Unikitty, because these episodes will make you not want to watch the show ever again regardless of their quality, because they all show the biggest issues with the show. With that said, do you want to know what one of my biggest issues with this show is and what could be a double-edged sword with it? The ways that the show treats one of its characters, Richard. Ever since episodes like Hide and Seek and Film Fest, the show oftentimes did 2 particular things to Richard. It was either him being ragged on for being boring, or him being treated as the show's punching bag. I'll do the latter in the next spot, as that's the worst example in that regard, but in this spot, I'm doing the former first. The show often treats Richard as the most boring character imaginable, to a point where it feels uncomfortable. Like the show has something against being boring. Filmfest being one of the biggest examples of this, as that episode has Unikitty constantly stalling for time because she has that low of an opinion on Richard, that she thinks that the film is going to be boring just because Richard is boring. However, since that episode does have the films that everyone made, it's exempt from being on this list, unlike the number 4 spot, Trapped in Paradise. So, here's the overall plot synopsis for this one. The Unigang decide out of nowhere to take a vacation by flying in a hot air balloon, and decide to take Richard without him giving his word on the whole thing, and they all end up getting trapped on a deserted island. Richard is rightfully freaked out about this, while the others don't mind it at all, despite the fact that they could potentially be stuck there forever, and the episode treats Richard like he's the bad guy for wanting the others to look over the Unikingdom. Now, I said that ever since the beginning of the show, it completely treated Richard like a punching bag, even in episodes that I like or just find okay, and that is definitely worse, which is why the next episode is worse. But there is the other issue that has haunted the show since the beginning, and that is the fact that the characters constantly look down on Richard because he's boring. I don't know what makes me more mad, the fact that the characters look down on someone for wanting to stand out from the crowd and be himself, or if it's because I relate to this a lot since, specifically back in 2016, I was in Richard's shoes. Much like number 1, it brings back memories of stuff that I was so against and I'm so against now. With the episode Hide and Seek, at the end of the episode, it was revealed that Unikitty was deliberately ignoring Richard because she really does look down on him because he's boring. This episode, though, shows the absolute worst of this particular problem. Throughout the entire episode, it constantly treats Richard like he's not a fun guy because he wants to get back home, despite the fact that, 1, they had work to do at the Unikingdom, as Richard said himself at the beginning of the episode. That's why Richard didn't want to go on vacation, because so much was on his mind that he didn't want to enjoy the vacation at the moment. And 2, and this is something that the episode says constantly, Richard does enjoy relaxing and going on vacation, guys. If you've seen all the other episodes, even some upcoming candidates on this list, Richard does show that there are some points where he does want to relax. The reason why he wasn't freaking out about work needing to be done in other episodes is because their schedule was all cleared and they had free time to do these things. In this episode, there was still work that needed to be done. Could you imagine if you had a job that you worked at and you needed to be there the next day for something important and all of a sudden you got dragged into going on vacation and you start freaking out? Does that mean that you should all of a sudden be called no fun and a party pooper? No, absolutely not. Because you need to be on time for your particular job every day so you could get paid to pay the bills and keep a roof over your head. And from what I know, most jobs don't allow you to take a vacation off unless they approve you to be able to do that. And that's the problem that applies to this episode. It constantly villainizes Richard for wanting to get back to the tower to do the things that needed to be done, when it's their job and responsibility to do so. But no, what puts this episode on the list, and this high might I add, is the reveal that the others were deliberately trying to get themselves stranded on the island, meaning that throughout the entire episode, all the characters were indeed aware that Richard was wanting to get back to the tower, yet they didn't care and ruin their chances to get back to the tower on purpose, putting their own feelings over one of their own members. If the others were unaware that Richard wanted to get back to the tower and destroyed all means of getting back, and were unaware of Richard wanting to get those opportunities, the episode still would have been bad, but it would have at least made it tolerable, and I would have probably put this episode at number 7 instead of where it is now. But no, it's revealed that they sabotaged their chances of not being stranded. Richard is rightfully disappointed in them, and he gives them a taste of their own medicine, which is honestly the only thing that saves this episode from being a tie with number 3. Granted, Richard did go a little too far by worrying the others by pretending that the island was sinking, but I do think that they needed to at least be taught a lesson. After your first viewing of this episode and you rewatch it and realize that the Unigang intended to do what they do in this episode, it really is going to make you look at the entire episode differently entirely. First Flight. Speaking of Richard being treated as badly as possible, do you want to know an issue that is worse with how the show often treats Richard than him being looked down on for being boring? Him being physically and emotionally beaten around. Ever since the episode Film Fest, aside from the boring shaming, do you want to know what the show has also done ever since? In at least one particular episode, even some that I already went over, the show has either put Richard in pain or emotionally scarred him. This is even an issue in episodes that I really do like or just find meh. R&R, for example, put Richard in pain constantly and tried to demonize him for wanting the others to do their chores. That episode doesn't make the list though because it does have creativity with what it's trying to go for. Same excuse cannot be applied to First Flight. I'll start off this spot by saying that I'm surprised that this episode isn't held up in high regard as one of the most hated episodes of the show, like Fire and Ice, R&R, Camp Unikitty, or 2 upcoming episodes are. Fire and Ice doesn't make the list either, as that episode does have 2 things that saves the episode from being bad, and those 2 things are the message and Master Frown getting a deserved comeuppance, as well as the impressive animation on Angry Kitty. But for First Flight, there is almost nothing to like about this episode, except for the subplot with Dr. Fox and Hotcodile, which I'll save for later in this entry. I'll at least give Trapped in Paradise something. At least Richard successfully got back at the others for what they did, and that episode did have potential, but the potential was so wasted that I found an episode of Jessie that had the same setup to be better than Trapped in Paradise in every single way. With First Flight, aside from the subplot, what could you even salvage from this? The short answer, nothing. In order to redeem this episode in any kind of way, is to restructure this episode into a completely different episode entirely. To describe exactly what I think is completely wrong with this episode, I'll say this. You know those Very Nice and Hot Dog Person segments from Uncle Grandpa? You know, the things that they would often show before going to commercial? To refresh your memory, these segments were about two characters, Very Nice and Hot Dog Person. In every single one of these segments, they tried something completely new. Very Nice ends up enjoying that new experience in every single way, while Hot Dog Person ends up being miserable in every way imaginable. This episode right here feels like one of those extended to 11 minutes, and somehow worse because those segments were only around 2 or 3 minutes long, while this episode is extra length, and that is not a good sign because I never liked those segments because of how unpleasant they were. In those shorts, Hot Dog Person is skeptical about trying something new. Very Nice insists on trying that new thing. He does, he feels miserable, and at the end of the short has Hot Dog Person being completely miserable. In this episode, same thing happens. Richard is nervous about going on the plane. Unikitty insists on Richard trying to be brave since this plane ride is having Crocodile drive. Since he has a plane test, Richard starts to become miserable in the middle of this episode, only this takes 4 times longer, and by the end, Richard is completely scarred. This episode also shares the same problems as 3 post-sequel SpongeBob episodes, Pineapple RV, Squids on a Bus, and Jolly Lodgers, most especially Pineapple RV and Jolly Lodgers, where this episode feels like it would have been much better if a particular character wasn't in this episode. And that's exactly the case with this episode, where it would have been much better if Richard was entirely absent from this episode. Not because Richard is bad in this episode, I actually feel very sorry for him, but instead, because him not being in this episode would have spared him from the amount of pain that he goes through in this episode. Oh yeah, Richard goes through a lot in this episode. At the beginning of the episode, it's implied that the 4 of them tricked Richard into going to this airport because from what I recall, Richard wasn't aware that they were going on a plane, and when they get on the plane and Richard starts freaking out, instead of them fixing his fear, they end up making his fear even worse because they take him out of his seat while the plane is constantly moving and have him being jump scared by things while being scared out of his mind. And this is all that happens to him throughout the episode until Crocodile crashes the plane, and he is still miserable even throughout the ending of the episode. While I can give this episode something in that Unikitty and Puppycorn didn't intend to make Richard even more miserable than at the beginning of the episode, which on that front, the intention behind this episode isn't as bad as the intention of Trapped in Paradise was. The episode is overall worse than Trapped in Paradise because Richard gets nothing but torment throughout the entire episode, without the episode even trying to give him a satisfying ending because of the amount of trash that was flung at him here. And while Crocodile does somewhat get comeuppance for what he did in the episode, it only served to give Richard more stress put onto him. Oh, and let's talk about that ending real quick. While not the worst ending of the entire series, it is beyond horrendous. Some people that have talked about this episode, some directly to me, said that the ending of this episode was satisfying. Curious question if you do think this way about this ending. Why? Because the thing that is implied in this episode's ending is flat out horrifying. Firstly, Unikitty. I get that you wanted to help Richard conquer his fear of flying, but after Richard went through all of these things that he did in this episode, it's a pretty bad idea to tell Richard that it wasn't so bad, wasn't it? As it would make him break down in tears, which is exactly what happened. He was actually crying. And it's implied that because Crocodile couldn't wait until his flight instructors got on the plane with him, that the very next week, Richard is going to go through the same trauma that he did in this episode, and at the very end, he moans in misery. What honestly does save this episode from being in the top 2 is honestly the subplot with Dr. Fox and Hawkdial, which makes me wonder why this episode wasn't about Hawkdial instead. You know, instead of this episode being nothing but a Richard torture episode, maybe the episode should have been about Hawkdial being nervous for this flight test, and have Dr. Fox be Hawkdial's substitute for that test. This probably would have made the episode, much like Pool Duel, one of my favorite episodes of the show, and probably other people's favorites as well, as some people that I talked to also considers this the best part of this whole thing. But the parts of Richard being beaten around do really bring it down to a point of no return. It's kind of funny, actually. There's a certain SpongeBob episode that a lot of people hate. That episode is Frozen Face Off. A lot of people hate that episode because of just one reason, that being the parts where Gary is treated as a sled dog, despite the fact that it's not a major part of the episode, and it's dropped halfway through, where Gary no longer has to be a sleigh dog, and I'm actually someone who liked Frozen Face Off because of all the other parts of the episode. With this episode, this problem is plagued and riddled throughout the whole episode, to a point where I would be completely on board with other people that would probably say that they hate this episode because of this one reason. Thankfully, after the show came back after a really long hiatus, and when they started giving us episodes like music videos and Unikitty in the Ice Pot Factory, the show never did this kind of plot ever again, and started having Richard come out on top, and the show started toning down the ways that the characters would treat Richard. And after episodes like this and Trapped in Paradise, thank God.
Beach days. Do you ever have that one thing in existence that you weren't too bothered by, but as time went on, you realized that you were way too generous towards that particular thing? Yeah, that is this episode in a nutshell. This is an episode that is much worse than I remember it being. Remember when I said in my number 9 segment that Pool Duel was nowhere near as bad as this episode? I wholeheartedly meant it, cause this is one of the most frustrating episodes of the whole show. Almost everything that you can imagine with this episode has nothing good going for it. Almost every aspect of it is wrong, except for one particular thing, the animation. Admittedly, the way that this episode is animated is amazing, that I'm going to start off by talking about that before I start tearing this episode to shreds. All the characters in this episode have shading on them, making them much more lively than usual. They have such good shading that when it gets to the point where the characters are in the desert, they have a brighter color on the sides of them. But what's even better than that are the backgrounds, especially the looks on the perfect spot near the end of the episode. It looks so beautiful, in fact, that I would actually want to see what the perfect spot would look like in the real world because of how gorgeous it looks here. It is a shame that this animation wasn't used ever again, not only because of the fact that it could have been used for something special like Unfairgrounds or the Birthday to End All Birthdays, or if they wanted to make a TV movie based off the show, but also because the episode that this animation is used for is awful! And I mean really awful.
Some people might be asking, wait, if you said that the animation is beautiful, why is this episode number 2 and not, say, number 6? Well, here's the thing. There's this particular statement that a lot of people say, which is, good writing can save bad animation, but bad writing can never be saved by good animation. And while this episode does have beautiful animation, it is one of the most frustrating episodes that I've ever seen. In fact, this episode being beautifully animated makes it much more insulting than if this episode had the show's usual animation, because from the looks on this one, it obviously has much more work put into it than the average Unikitty episode. But this amount of work is completely put into the wrong place. The amount of work that was done here should have been put into one of the specials, or even the other beach episode's Sunken Treasure. So the perfect place to start with the bashing of this episode is Master Frown. Believe it or not, the way that the show treats Richard isn't the biggest problem with the show. No, that title goes to Master Frown and how much of a thorn he is on this show's side. And before someone comes in and says this, and I know that they're going to say it, I get it. Master Frown is supposed to be the villain of the series. It's his job to make others miserable. But there's only so far that you could push this excuse before said character starts becoming painful to put up with. And there are multiple times in this show where he does things like this in attempts to get under my skin. Fire and Ice, as I mentioned earlier, had him constantly being a nuisance throughout the entire thing. Same thing with Birthday Blowout. But to these episodes' credit, Master Frown does not get off scot-free from doing what he did in those episodes, which does make them at least tolerable. Same excuse cannot be said with this and number 1. Yes, Master Frown does not win in the end of the episode, which does make this episode a step up from number 1, but however, the Unigang don't win either. That's the other issue with this episode and why I dislike it so much. What did the Unigang do to deserve what they got in this episode? Absolutely nothing. All they wanted to do was just have a relaxing beach day, but the entire episode aspires to literally tell them no, when they didn't do anything to deserve this at all. Master Frown at the beginning limits all of them into literally doing nothing, and he basically tries to steal the Unigang spot at the perfect spot, because he wants them to suffer after coming all that way, just for them to have their spot stolen. And then, just when you thought that the Unigang were finally going to have some time to themselves, and after Master Frown rightfully gets his comeuppance, one of the worst endings in Unikitty happens. The robot crab that Dr. Fox made basically betrays all of them, even Dr. Fox who made her, and the Unigang get taken away by the gang of crabs while the robot crab just sits there and does nothing. When I first saw this episode, I had no idea what others thought of it, until I said to an online friend of mine that I thought that this was the worst episode of the week that this episode aired, and he basically agreed with me, which I was surprised about given the unpopular opinion that I had on the episode Pet Pet, as well as episodes that you've already seen on this list, like Tooth Trouble, Delivery Effect, Trapped in Paradise, and First Flight. And if anything, when I first watched this episode, I was far too nice towards this episode. I originally put it as not that bad and finding Pet Pet worse. Ha, not being as bad as Pet Pet. This being one of the worst episodes of the series is more like it. At this point, the only things that prevent this episode from being worse is the parts where the Unigang actually do have fun on this adventure, and the animation in general. Honestly, if it wasn't for the last candidate on this list, this segment would be the number 1 spot, and I would be a lot more angry. And even without the slight positives that I gave this episode, it would still be no match for what ended up getting the number 1 spot. With that being said, with all the cons that I went over with this episode, some of you might be thinking, what could possibly be worse than this episode? It has a lot of frustrating elements and it wasted good animation. Well, to answer that question, in marathoning and binging all of the episodes of this show initially, believe it or not, I actually found an episode that is even worse. It is the only episode of the series that I got legit angry with and baffled at after seeing it. What is the episode? Well, with that said, let's go. Election Day. I have a burning dislike for this episode so much. If I were to make a top 10 worst episodes of good cartoons list, without no hesitation, I would immediately put this episode on the list. Not as number 1, but I would definitely put it in the top 6 easily. The many ways in which this episode fails is simply magical. No joke, guys. Almost everything that this episode does is irredeemable. The citizens of the Unikingdom are unlikable and completely brain dead, as they can't tell the difference between Master Frown and real-life pictures. Master Frown himself is completely manipulative throughout the whole thing and goes out of his way to make Unikitty look as bad as possible. I swear, Master Frown before the birthday to end all birthdays was the bane of this show's existence. Puppycorn is completely unlikable towards his own sister by taking Master Frown's side, when Unikitty is his own sister and part of his family. The episode has the exact same problem as Beach Days. It has some kind of a vendetta against a particular character throughout the whole episode, except I actually dislike Master Frown much more in this episode because of how much he tries to act like the victim throughout the whole thing, and at least Beach Days kept all of its character in character throughout. Meanwhile, this episode throws out all of their likability to fit the plot, and so much more. But the things that cements this episode as number 1 is its beyond insulting ending, where they basically try to taunt us into cheering for Unikitty, only for her to be shunted by the citizens again, and the messages that this episode teaches is abhorrent. It tries to teach kids that you shouldn't try to fight back when your reputation is being stomped on. And I really dislike how this episode lets Master Frown get off scot-free way too easily, when he's been doing nothing but acting manipulative, and not too long before, he basically trash-talked about all the citizens behind their backs, and also talked about the atrocious rules that he was going to put onto the Unikingdom. And Unikitty, after all the things that he did to you throughout the entire episode, Master Frown does not deserve any mercy from you. He literally tried to ruin your reputation and trash talk about the citizens behind their backs. He doesn't deserve to have his feelings get spared. He should have gotten exposed for the stuff that he pulled in this episode. And while Master Frown doesn't win in this episode, he didn't even get a comeuppance when this is the worst thing that he's ever done, because in those other episodes that he was bad in, he at least didn't try to soil someone's public image. The most that he did was just slightly annoy others. And at the end of the episode, that duck that just says quack wins, just because he voted last, when he was not even elected in the first place, and the ending doesn't explain if the others were still going to be able to live there or not. The episode just ends right there. To this very day, this is the only episode of Unikitty that I remember getting legitimately angry with. I mean, I got mildly annoyed with episodes like Beach Days. I got bored with Delivery Effect, and upset because of how bad I felt for Richard with First Flight and Trapped in Paradise, but this is the only time that I needed to vent out my frustrations with an episode because it really did annoy me that much. This is one episode that I was actually debating about for a year on whether I should review it or not, because the episode really is that bad. However, I don't know if I could get enough material out of this episode to get the review to the 10-minute mark, because I do want to get enough material out of something to get a good explanation for why I don't like this episode in a full format. But whether or not I do or don't want to review this episode, it is without a shadow of a doubt my choice for the number 1 worst Unikitty episode of all time. I'm so glad that I got all of these episodes off my chest, since this was a countdown that I wanted to do for a while, and this video had me listing out all the problems with the show in general. The best list is going to outnumber all of those problems that I have with the show, as there are a bunch of things that I do like about this show. Anyways, this is Sean S., signing out.